Have you ever felt that chill when turning the page of an ancient tome? Or sensed unseen eyes watching from shadowed corners of a gaslit room? These feelings echo the power of Gothic fiction, stories that cling to the darkest recesses of the mind and whisper through time. Welcome to my world, my tales, where we delve into the very heart of these enduring nightmares. Prepare yourself because today, we journey into the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian England to uncover tales of immortal predators thirsting for blood. Portraits that age while their subjects remain eternally youthful. Brilliant minds divided between good and evil, and ancestral homes harboring secrets that should remain in. These are just a few of the captivating horrors whose dreadful stories await. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, your guide through the darkened corridors and candlelit chambers of Gothic literature. Follow me as we explore 16 tales of terror that have haunted the imagination for generations. Let us begin our descent into the shadows of the Victorian mind, where monsters lurk not just in distant castles, but within the human heart itself. Dracula, the immortal thirst. Listen closely, and I will tell you of a time when the boundaries between life and death blurred. When ancient evil found its way from distant Carpathian mountains to the very heart of Victorian London. It was an age of progress when science and reason illuminated the darkest corners of existence, when the empire's might stretched across the globe, and when a proper Englishman like Jonathan Harker might find himself journeying to remote Transylvania on a simple matter of real estate. But in that distant land, in a castle, perched precariously upon the edge of a terrible precipice, waited something ancient, something patient. Count Dracula, a nobleman of distinguished bearing, but with eyes that had witnessed centuries pass like fleeting moments. Enter Abraham van Helsing, the Dutch physician whose knowledge extended beyond conventional medicine into the arcane law of the undead. He knew what others refused to believe, that some evils cannot be explained by modern science, that some predators wear the mask of refinement. Poor Lucy Westenra, beautiful and pure, became the Count's first victim on English soil. Her transformation from vibrant maiden to bloodthirsty creature of the night served as a grim harbinger of Dracula's intentions. The horror of her fate, staked through the heart, decapitated, her mouth filled with garlic, was matched only by the greater horror of what she had become. And then there was Mina Murray, Jonathan's fiancée, whose very soul became the battlefield upon which this war between ancient darkness and modern virtue would be waged. The scene in which Dracula forces her to drink from his own chest, a perverse communion binding her to him, remains one of literature's most disturbing moments. The tale unfolds across Europe, from the fog-bound streets of London to the wild Carpathian passes. A desperate pursuit of a monster who commands wolves transforms into mist and sleeps in unhallowed earth. A monster who, though possessing supernatural strength, must abide by certain rules. He cannot enter a home uninvited, fears the crucifix, and can only rest in the soil of his homeland. Bram Stoker's genius lay not merely in creating a monster, but in fashioning a creature of contradictions, aristocratic yet bestial, sophisticated yet savage, a being who offers eternal life through the very act of taking it. Through Dracula, Stoker gave form to Victorian anxieties about sexuality, immigration, and the autistic forces lurking beneath civilization's veneer. The Count's destruction in the novel's climax, his throat slashed, his heart pierced, represents the triumph of modernity over ancient superstition, of Christianity over paganism, of collaborative effort over solitary predation. Yet his shadow looms ever larger as decades pass. For while Dracula dies in Stoker's pages, he has achieved a different immortality in our collective imagination. A literary undeath that ensures his story will be told and retold so long as we fear what lurks in darkness. This then is the true power of Dracula, not merely to frighten, but to embody fears that transcend his time and reach into our own. The Count remains eternally watching from beyond the grave, waiting for an invitation to cross the threshold once more. The picture of Dorian Gray, beauty's corruption. Imagine a London drawing room, tastefully appointed, where wit sparkles like champagne and aesthetics are elevated to a religion. In this rarefied atmosphere, we first encounter the exquisite Dorian Gray, blessed with a beauty so perfect, so transcendent, that it inspires artist Basil Hallward to create his masterpiece, a portrait capturing youth in all its untainted splendor. Enter Lord Henry Wotton, whose silver tongue drips with seductive philosophy. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. He purrs upon Dorian's ears like poison honey. As Dorian gazes upon his own painted image, a terrible wish forms in his heart that the portrait might age while he himself remains forever young. Some wishes once spoken cannot be unspoken. Some bargains once struck cannot be undone. And so begins Dorian's descent, the corruption of absolute beauty, the privileging of sensation above all else. Each sin, each cruelty, each indulgence leaves no mark upon his angelic face, but transforms his portrait, locked away in a forgotten attic room. The painting becomes a ledger of iniquity, a visual record of a soul in decay. Think of Sybil Vane, the young actress whose heart Dorian casually breaks, leading to her suicide. Think of Basil Hallward himself, confronting Dorian with his moral dissolution, only to be rewarded with a knife to the throat. Think of the opium dens Dorian frequents, seeking ever more exotic sensations as ordinary pleasures grow stale on his palate. All the while, behind a locked door, beneath a purple shroud, the portrait transforms. Handsome features twist into a mask of cruelty. Clear eyes grow cunning and cold. The mouth that once expressed only innocence curls with the knowledge of unspeakable acts. It is Dorian's true self, his soul made visible. While he walks through London, society unchanged, unaged, a beautiful shell housing bottomless corruption. Oscar Wilde's only novel scandalized Victorian society, not merely for its homoerotic undertones, but for its challenge to the very moral foundations of the age. Through Dorian, Wilde explores the consequences of aesthetic philosophy taken to its logical extreme, the separation of beauty from goodness, of appearance from essence. The novel's climax arrives with devastating inevitability. Dorian, haunted by his crimes, yet unwilling to repent, attacks the portrait with the same knife that killed Basil. In that moment, the supernatural pact inverts. Servants find an old man withered and hideous dead upon the floor, while from the canvas, Dorian Gray stares back in all his original, unspoiled beauty. Wilde's masterpiece endures not merely as a Gothic tale of supernatural horror, but as a philosophical inquiry into the nature of art, beauty, and morality. It asks questions that remain unsettlingly relevant. What price would we pay for eternal youth? What happens when we divorce aesthetics from ethics? How many of us keep our own metaphorical portraits locked away, hidden even from ourselves? In Dorian Gray, Wilde created not just a character, but an archetype. The beautiful monster whose monstrosity remains concealed behind a perfect facade. A cautionary tale wrapped in exquisite prose. A horror story for an age obsessed with appearances. A mirror held up to a society that often confused the virtuous with the merely respectable. Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. Let us turn our gaze to a different sort of monster, one born not of ancient evil, but of modern ambition. One summer night in 1816 on the shores of Lake Geneva, during a ghost story competition among literary friends, a young woman of only 18 had a waking nightmare that would birth one of literature's most enduring creations. Mary Shelley's vision became Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, a tale that begins with ice, with Captain Walton's Arctic expedition encountering a haggarded Victor Frankenstein in pursuit of his creation across the frozen wastes. It is a story told within a story, a Russian doll of narratives at whose center lies a terrible act of creation. Victor Frankenstein, brilliant and obsessive, a student of natural philosophy at Ingolstadt University, becomes consumed by the desire to penetrate the secrets of heaven and earth. Not content with existing knowledge, he seeks the very principle of life itself. In Carol houses and dissection rooms, he gathers the materials for his great work. Human remains assembled into a new being, a patchwork man of gigantic stature. On a dreary November night, success. Electricity courses through dead tissue. Lifeless matter stirs. The creature opens its watery yellow eyes, and Victor recoils in horror at what he has made. "Beautiful, great God," he exclaims. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxurians only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set. Unlike Dracula or Dorian Gray, Frankenstein's creature is abandoned from birth, cast out by his creator, forced to make his own way in a world that recoils from his appearance. Through the creature's eyes, we experience the cruelty of humanity, the pain of rejection, the desperate longing for connection. We watch as he educates himself by observing a poor family, learning language, emotion, and ultimately his own origins through Victor's laboratory journals. The creature's eloquence is perhaps the novel's most unsettling element. He does not merely destroy, he philosophizes about his destruction. He does not merely hate, he articulates why he hates. When he confronts Victor on the Alpine glacier, demanding a female companion, his argument is both rational and moving. "I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces in triumph. Remember that and tell me why I should pity man more than he pies me." Victor initially agrees to create a mate for his creature, only to destroy the female form before completion, fearing a race of such beings. The creature's revenge is methodical and terrible. The murder of Victor's youngest brother, the framing of an innocent servant girl, the strangulation of Victor's bride, Elizabeth, on their wedding night. Grief drives Victor to pursue his creation to the ends of the earth, leading us back to the Arctic, where the novel began. Mary Shelley's masterpiece transcends simple horror to become a complex meditation on scientific responsibility, the consequences of playing God, the necessity of love and acceptance in human development, and the destructive power of rejection. Written at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, it poignantly questions humanity's relationship with technology and power. The novel ends as it began in ice with Victor's death aboard Walton's ship and the creature's appearance to mourn his creator. In the creature's final monologue, he vows to build his own funeral pea and end his unnatural existence, leaving us with an image of self-immolation amidst the Arctic vastness. A monster seeking final release from the burden of his own existence. Frankenstein's creature has shuffled through our collective imagination for 2 centuries now, though often misnamed as Frankenstein himself. A confusion that perhaps speaks to the inextricable bond between creator and created, between Victor and his nameless atom. He remains literature's most eloquent monster, a being whose monstrosity lies not in his appearance, but in his abandonment, whose violence stems not from inherent evil, but from the absence of love. The raven never more from monsters of flesh and blood. Let us turn to the spectral visitors that haunt the chambers of the mind. Edgar Allan Poe, master of the macabre, gave us many such apparitions, but none more famous than the ebony bird that tapped upon a chamber door. One bleak December midnight, the raven is not merely a poem, but an architectural marvel of mounting dread, a cathedral of grief and madness, constructed word by careful word. Consider its setting: a midnight dreary, a weary scholar surrounded by forgotten lore, seeking distraction from memories of his lost Lenore. The atmosphere is established with precision, the dying embers casting shadows on the floor, the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of purple curtains, the darkness that seems almost tangible. Then comes the tapping, gentle at first, growing more insistent. The scholar, already unsettled, attempts rational explanation, perhaps a visitor, perhaps the wind. But when he opens his door to darkness there, and nothing more, we feel the first cold fingers of supernatural dread upon our spines. The tapping continues now at his window. Upon opening it, in steps the stately raven perching upon the bust of Pallas Athena, goddess of wisdom, an ironic roosting place for a bird that will drive the scholar to the brink of madness. The bird speaks but a single word, nevermore. What follows is a psychological descent charted in 18 perfect stanzas. The scholar moves from amusement to curiosity, from hope to despair, from sanity to something approaching madness. He asks the bird questions, knowing full well what its only answer can be, torturing himself with confirmations of his worst fears. "Is there balm in Gilead?" he asks, seeking spiritual comfort. "Nevermore," replies the raven. "Will he clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore in the afterlife? Nevermore. Can he forget his lost love? Nevermore." The poem's final image is one of eternal torment. The raven still sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, its eyes having all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, while the scholar's soul trapped beneath the bird's shadow shall be lifted nevermore. Published in 1845, The Raven made Poe instantly famous. Its hypnotic rhythm, its ingenious internal rhymes, its mounting tension, and its exploration of grief's destructive power resonated deeply with Victorian readers, who were themselves obsessed with mourning rituals and the aesthetic of death. What makes The Raven a cornerstone of Gothic literature is not merely its supernatural visitor, but its psychological acuity. The true horror lies not in the bird itself, but in the scholar's projection of meaning onto it. The raven becomes a mirror reflecting his own inconsolable grief, his own fears of eternal separation from his beloved. Is the bird a messenger from the afterlife? A manifestation of the scholar's fractured psyche? A literal demon come to torment him? Poe leaves these questions deliberately unanswered, understanding that ambiguity deepens terror. What is certain is that The Raven serves as both catalyst and witness to a mind unraveling under the pressure of loss. In this, Poe captured something universal about grief's capacity to distort perception, to make us seek meaning in coincidence, to transform ordinary objects into vessels of supernatural significance. The Raven's Nevermore echoes through literary history, not because it tells us anything new about death's finality, but because it articulates that knowledge in a way that makes it freshly, terribly immediate. The poem's enduring power lies in its perfect marriage of sound and sense, of form and content. The Troic octameter mimics a funeral dirge. The refrain nevermore falls like a closing tomb door. Even the assonance of open vowels creates a mournful music that lingers in the ear long after reading. Through The Raven, Poe achieved what every Gothic writer aspires to. He made his readers feel the chill breath of the uncanny upon their necks, the shadow of wings across their souls. He reminded us that sometimes the most frightening hauntings are those that occur within the chambers of our own minds, where grief and guilt and longing roost like dark birds, speaking their terrible truths in voices we cannot silence. Jekyll and Hyde, the beast within. In the fog-shrouded streets of London, a small man with a cruel face and a curious troglodytic appearance commits an act of casual violence. What does he do? He tramples a child underfoot, continuing on his way without a backward glance. Later, this same figure, Edward Hyde by name, bludgeons an elderly gentleman to death with a heavy cane, disappearing into the London night. Can evil have a face? Can darkness have a name? These brutal acts form the dark heart of Robert Louis Stevenson's exploration of humanity's dual nature. Strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But our tale begins not with Jekyll or Hyde, but with the respectable lawyer, Mr. Utterson. He notices something odd, doesn't he? The curious will of his friend, the eminent Dr. Henry Jekyll. What does this document stipulate? That should Jekyll disappear or die, all his possessions should pass to one Edward Hyde, a man Utterson has never heard mentioned before. Strange, is it not? What connection could exist between the respected physician and this sinister stranger? Thus begins a mystery that peels back the veneer of Victorian respectability to reveal the seething impulses beneath. Do you recognize this conflict? The battle between our higher and lower natures, the struggle we all face. Stevenson's genius lies in the gradual revelation of his central conceit. Modern readers approach the text knowing that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same, but the original Victorian audience experienced the story as a genuine mystery with the truth withheld until the final chapters. This structure mirrors Jekyll's own compartmentalization of his darker nature, hidden, denied, yet increasingly impossible to contain. Consider the physical descriptions of these two aspects of a single man. Jekyll is handsome, well-made, with every mark of capacity and kindness. the very image of Victorian success and moral rectitude. In Hyde, he is pale and dwarfish, giving an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. Witnesses report feeling an instinctive revulsion in his presence, as if sensing the malevolence that radiates from him. Have you ever met someone who filled you with inexplicable dread, whose very presence seemed to chill the air around them? Through his famous potion, Jackal believes he has solved the problem of man's dual nature, separating his higher and lower selves into distinct entities. Man is not truly one, but truly two, he writes in his final confession. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. What begins as an experiment in moral philosophy becomes an addiction, doesn't it? Jackal finds himself increasingly drawn to the freedom Hyde represents. Freedom from social constraint, from ethical consideration, from consequence. The respectable doctor by day, the uninhibited monster by night. Who among us has not felt the temptation? The urge to cast off restraint, to indulge our darkest impulses, but the transformation becomes increasingly difficult to control. Hyde grows stronger with each manifestation while Jackal weakens. Eventually, the process begins to occur spontaneously, with Jackal waking to find himself transformed into Hyde without having taken the potion. The boundary between the two selves, once seemingly absolute, becomes porous and unstable. Can you imagine the horror? To fall asleep yourself and awaken as another? To lose control of your very identity? In the novel's climax, Jackal's loyal butler breaks down the laboratory door to discover what? Hyde's twitching body, clad in clothes too large for his frame, Jackal's clothes. The suicide note reveals all. Jackal, unable to procure the rare salt needed for his potion, found himself permanently trapped in Hyde's form. Rather than face justice as the murderer Hyde, he has taken his own life. Published in 1886, Stevenson's novella arrived at a moment when Victorian society was increasingly concerned with questions of degeneration, atavism, and criminal psychology. Through Jackal and Hyde, Stevenson gives fictional form to theories like those of Cesare Lombroso, who argued that criminals represented evolutionary throwbacks identifiable by physical characteristics. Yet the novel transcends its historical moment to speak to universal human anxieties about the fragmentation of identity, the tension between social persona and private desire, the fear that beneath our civilized exteriors lurks something primitive and dangerous. Jackal and Hyde are not merely character names, but have entered our lexicon as shorthand for the duality that exists within each of us. The story's setting, a London of swirling fog, gas lamps casting uncertain light, respectable facades, concealing sordid back streets, serves as the perfect externalization of its psychological concerns. The city itself becomes a manifestation of the divided self, with Soho, where Hyde has his lodgings representing the ID to the superego of London's more respectable quarters. Perhaps most disturbing is the implication that Hyde, rather than being a foreign element within Jackal, represents something essential about him. Desires repressed but never eliminated, impulses denied but never destroyed. As Jackal himself admits, all human beings are commingled out of good and evil, his fatal error. Not in recognizing this truth, but in believing he could surgically separate these aspects of himself without consequences. Look in the mirror tonight. What face stares back at you, and what other face might lurk behind those familiar eyes waiting for its chance to emerge? The fall of the House of Usher, decay of mind and matter. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, have you ever read words that seemed to press upon your very soul to create an atmosphere so thick you could almost touch it? So begins Edgar Allan Poe's masterpiece of atmospheric terror, The Fall of the House of Usher. From its opening sentence, the tale establishes a mood of inescapable dread, a sense that we are entering a realm where the normal laws of nature and reason have begun to fray. Our unnamed narrator approaches the House of Usher. How does he describe it? An ancient family mansion of insufferable gloom, spreading a sense of insufferable sorrow over him, like an infection. Why has he come to this dreadful place? At the urgent request of his childhood friend, Roderick Usher, who suffers from a nervous affection that has reduced him to a state of hypersensitivity and constant terror. The house itself, can you see it? A facade with vacant eye-like windows, fungi spreading over the stonework like veins beneath sickly skin, a barely perceptible fissure running from roof to foundation. This crack, initially dismissed as a structural quirk, becomes the physical manifestation of the family's degeneracy, the architectural expression of a bloodline reaching its terminal point. Who dwells within these decaying walls? The last science of the Usher lineage, Rodri and his twin sister Malene, both suffer from mysterious maladies. He from a morbid acuteness of the senses that makes ordinary stimuli unbearable. She from a wasting cataleptic disorder that leaves her periodically rigid and deathlike. They are in essence the human equivalents of their ancestral home, ancient, fragile, and teetering on the edge of final collapse. Have you ever felt a place affect your very thoughts, your mood, your sanity? The atmosphere of the house works upon the narrator, who finds himself swept into Rodri's macabre aestheticism. They read strange texts. Rodri composes unearthly music. They engage in bizarre artistic pursuits that seem designed to channel rather than dispel their host's growing madness. Rodri's paintings are described as revealing an intensity of intolerable awe, while his improvised dirges contain a full knowledge of the power of sound to unsettle the human mind. Then comes the pivotal event. Malene apparently dies, and Roderick insists on temporarily entombing her within the house rather than committing her to the ground. The two men carry her coffin to a copper-lined vault deep beneath the mansion. The narrator notes with growing unease Malene's lifelike appearance, the flush still visible in her cheeks and lips. Can the dead sometimes appear to live? Can the living sometimes appear as dead? As days pass, Rodri's mental state deteriorates further. During a night of unusual atmospheric disturbance, a whirlwind, strange light emanating from the grounds, the narrator attempts to calm his friend by reading aloud from an old romance. What happens next? In a moment of sublime Gothic horror, the fictitious sounds described in the story begin to be echoed by actual sounds within the house: creaking, cracking, indistinct moaning. The climax arrives with terrifying symmetry as the narrator reads of a door being broken down. In the story, the chamber door swings open to reveal what? Malene Usher, bloodied from her struggle to escape the vault, standing in her burial shroud. She falls forward upon her brother and both collapse dead. She from exhaustion, he from terror. The narrator flees as the house itself begins to disintegrate, the fissure widening until the entire structure crumbles into the tarn below, leaving no trace of the ancient House of Usher. Published in 1839, The Fall of the House of Usher represents Poe at the height of his powers. The story exemplifies his theory of the unity of effect with every element: setting, character, incident, even sentence structure, contributing to the overall atmosphere of dread and decay. What distinguishes this tale within the Gothic tradition, its radical ambiguity: is the house sentient? Does some supernatural connection exist between the building and its inhabitants? Is Roderick mad, or does he possess a terrible clarity about forces beyond normal perception? Has Malene been buried alive due to her brother's mistake? Or was it a subconsciously deliberate act stemming from unnatural feelings between the twins? Poe refuses to resolve these questions, understanding that uncertainty itself is a powerful tool of terror. The tale also introduces the concept Poe called the sentience of all vegetable things, the unsettling idea that inanimate objects might possess a form of consciousness, that buildings might absorb and reflect the psychological states of their inhabitants. Have you ever sensed that a place remembered what had happened within its walls? That a house could be more than just stone and timber? Through the House of Usher, both family and dwelling, Poe explores themes of hereditary decline, the connection between psychological and physical deterioration, the thin boundary between life and death, and the power of morbid imagination to manifest its fears in reality. He gives us not merely a ghost story, but a complex symbolic system in which every element reflects and reinforces every other, creating a hermetically sealed universe of terror from which there is no escape but complete annihilation. The enduring power of the fall of the House of Asher lies in its perfect fusion of psychological and supernatural horror. Its suggestion that the most terrifying hauntings may be those that blur the boundaries between external threat and internal fear, between the crumbling mansion and the disintegrating mind. Listen closely tonight. Do the sounds you hear in your own house match exactly the settling of old timbers? Or might there be something else? Something responding to the workings of your own troubled mind? The phantom of the opera, music of the night. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and gilded splendor of the Paris Opera House, far below the feet of elegant patrons and costume performers, there exists another world. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the foundations of grand buildings? What secrets might be hidden in the darkness? A labyrinth of tunnels, chambers carved from stone, an underground lake where, as Gaston Leroux tells us, dwells a being of both genius and monstrosity. The Phantom of the Opera, published in 1910, but set in the late 19th century. Leroux's novel begins as an investigation. Strange occurrences plague the opera. What horrors unfold within those walls? A chandelier crashes inexplicably into the audience. A stagehand is found hanged. Performers report glimpses of a skeletal figure in evening dress. Managers receive notes demanding Box 5 be kept empty and that a young soprano, Christine Dye, be given leading roles. Who sends these demands? Who watches from the shadows? The heart of the tale lies in three figures bound by music and obsession. Christine Dye, a Swedish soprano of extraordinary talent but humble background. Raoul Vicomte d'Anchy, her childhood friend and aristocratic suitor, and the figure known variously as the Phantom, the opera ghost, or by his true name, Eric. Christine believes her vocal training comes from the angel of music her late father promised to send, but who truly speaks to her through the walls of her dressing room, who cultivates both her voice and her psychological dependence. When he finally reveals himself physically, taking her to his subterranean domain, she discovers the terrible truth. Her angel is a man, but what manner of man? One whose face is so disfigured that he must wear a mask to be bearable to human sight. Have you ever loved someone you could not bear to look upon or been unable to look away from something that horrified you? Eric's underground home tells us everything about its inhabitant, a Gothic space that externally reflects its owner's internal state. What does it contain? A beautiful bedroom modeled after a Persian palace for Christine, a torture chamber designed to drive victims mad, and most disturbingly, a mannequin created in Christine's likeness dressed in a wedding gown. The Phantom's domain is both sanctuary and prison, both artists' retreat and madman's cell. The novel's most famous scene arrives like a thunderclap. Christine's curiosity leads her to remove Eric's mask, revealing what? A face described as a death's head with sunken eyes, absent nose, and lips like rotting flesh. This moment of unveiling, a classic Gothic trope, marks the transformation of the Phantom from mysterious mentor to obsessive antagonist. As his unrequited love for Christine twists into possessive rage, Leroux draws on centuries of folklore about deformed beings dwelling in subterranean spaces. From Greek myths of the Minotaur to medieval tales of bell ringers, creating in Eric a figure who embodies the fear of what lurks beneath civilization's surface. Yet he also invests this monster with profound humanity. Eric's genius as composer, architect, and ventriloquist is matched only by his loneliness, his yearning for normal human connection. The narrative builds to its crisis when Eric kidnaps Christine from the stage during a performance of Faust's. Raoul and a Persian mysterious figure from Eric's past descend into the labyrinth to rescue her, only to be trapped in the torture chamber. Meanwhile, Eric presents Christine with an ultimatum: marry him and live, or refuse him and cause the death of Raoul the Persian and hundreds of opera patrons through a planned explosion. What choice would you make faced with such terrible options? In the novel's climactic scene, Christine shows Eric compassion that he has never before experienced. She not only agrees to stay with him, but kisses him on his deformed forehead. This simple act of kindness, accepting rather than recoiling from his monstrosity, breaks something in the Phantom. He releases her along with Raoul and the Persian, choosing redemption through sacrifice rather than possession through force. Leroux's novel operates on multiple levels as a suspenseful mystery, as a tragic love story, as a parable about the transformative power of art, and as an exploration of how society creates its own monsters through rejection and isolation. Eric is both villain and victim, his violence stemming directly from the cruelty he has experienced since birth due to his appearance. The Phantom does not die dramatically on stage as in many adaptations. Rather, he expires alone of a broken heart, his body discovered later. Leroux's final revelation that Eric's body has disappeared from the opera cellars, leaving only his mask behind, suggests that some phantoms can never be fully exorcised. Next time you attend the opera, glance up at the empty boxes and down at the orchestra pit. Is someone watching from the shadows? Do you hear music that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once? The opera ghost may be closer than you think. The Haunted Mill, vengeance beyond the grave. In the village of Weirbridge stands an old flour mill abandoned and shrouded in whispers. What do the villagers say about it? That it's haunted by the ghost of Jacob Pinkerton, its former owner, who was found drowned in the mill pond under mysterious circumstances 15 years prior. Do you believe in ghosts, dear listener? In spirits that cannot rest until justice is done? The villagers avoid the place after dark. They cross themselves when they must pass it. They speak in hushed tones of strange light seen in the windows, in unearthly wails emanating from within its decaying walls. Into this superstitious community arrives John Lester, a rational man of business who has inherited the property from a distant relative. What does he think of local fears? He dismisses them as peasant ignorance, announcing his intention to refurbish the mill and restore it to working order. The villagers warn him against such sacrilege, but Lester, a man of science and industrial progress, scoffs at their concerns. Have you ever been so certain of your rational understanding of the world that you dismissed warnings you should have heeded? Yet even Lester cannot entirely suppress a shudder when he first enters the mill's cavernous interior. Cobwebs drape the ancient machinery like funeral shrouds. Rats scurry across rotting floorboards. The great millstone sits silent, covered in dust, while the wooden water heat outside has partially collapsed into the dark waters below. Against all advice, Lester decides to spend a night alone in the mill to prove its lack of supernatural inhabitants. Armed with a pistol, a lamp, and a flask of brandy, he settles into what was once Jacob Pinkerton's office. As midnight approaches, he begins to doubt his skepticism. The wind through broken windows sounds uncomfortably like human moaning. Shadows cast by his lamp take on grotesque, shifting forms. The ancient timbers of the mill creak and groan as if bearing a terrible weight. Just as the clock strikes 12, the true haunting begins. What happens in that terrible hour? The mill wheel, rotted and broken, begins to turn of its own accord. The grinding stones start to rotate, though no grain feeds them. A spectral figure materializes. Jacob Pinkerton, his clothes and hair still dripping with pond water, his bloated face contorted in rage, his eyes glowing with unearthly phosphorescence. The ghost points an accusing finger not at Lester, but at a portrait hanging on the wall. A handsome man, and identified as William Hilliard, Jacob's nephew and former business partner. Through a series of terrifying visions, the ghost reveals the truth. Hilliard, eager to gain control of the profitable mill, murdered Jacob by striking him unconscious and throwing him into the mill pond, then claimed the death was accidental. Have you ever suspected that accidents might sometimes be murder most foul? That secrets lie buried, waiting for someone to uncover them? The spectral Jacob leads the trembling Lester to a hidden compartment where proof of the murder lies concealed. Hilliard's blood-stained handkerchief and a letter in which Jacob expressed fear for his life. The ghost demands justice before it can rest, compelling Lester to swear he will expose the murderer. Dawn finds Lester half-mad with terror, but resolute in his promise. Investigation reveals that William Hilliard, having squandered his ill-gotten gains, now lives in London under an assumed name. Justice is ultimately served when Hilliard, confronted with the evidence of his crime, confesses and takes his own life, rather than face public shame in execution. Lester returns to the mill after Hilliard's death. Though still uneasy, he finds the atmosphere changed. The oppressive sense of malevolence has lifted when he renovates and reopens the mill. No further supernatural manifestations occur. The ghost of Jacob Pinkerton, having secured the justice it sought, has finally found rest. Mary Elizabeth Braden's tale exemplifies several classic elements of Victorian ghost stories. The emphasis on restorative justice, the idea that spirits remain earthbound due to unfinished business, and the uneasy marriage of rationalism with supernatural phenomena. Unlike earlier Gothic works set in distant times or exotic locations, the haunted mill brings terror into a recognizable contemporary English setting, suggesting that the uncanny lurks not in remote castles, but in the familiar landscapes of rural industry. The mill itself serves as a potent symbol, a place where grain is crushed between stones, where water power is harnessed to human purpose, where natural elements are transformed through mechanical means. In its abandoned state, it represents industrialization gone wrong, technology without humanity, progress perverted by greed. The ghost manipulation of the mill machinery emphasizes this theme, turning the instruments of progress into vehicles of supernatural retribution. Next time you pass an abandoned building, listen carefully to the sounds within. Is it merely the wind, the settling of old timbers? Or might there be something else? Something that waits for justice? Something that cannot rest until its story is told? Corilla, the Vampire's Kiss. 25 years before Bram Stoker introduced Count Dracula to the world, another vampire stalked the pages of Gothic literature, one whose seductive power and transgressive nature continue to fascinate readers. Do you know her name? Carmilla. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, established many of the conventions of vampire fiction while daring to explore themes of forbidden desire that Victorian society preferred to leave unspoken. Our story unfolds in Styria, a remote region of Austria, where young Laura lives with her father in an ancient, somewhat dilapidated castle. Isolated and lonely, Laura recalls a strange childhood experience. What vision disturbed her youthful slumber? Awakening to find a beautiful young woman kneeling beside her bed, who then seems to disappear into the floor. This visitation, seemingly a dream, leaves Laura with a sensation of pleasant pain and marks the beginning of a connection that will define her life. Years later, a carriage accident near their castle brings an unexpected guest into Laura's secluded existence. A mysterious countess traveling with her daughter requests temporary shelter for the girl, while the mother continues on urgent business. The daughter's name, Carmilla, a languid, beautiful young woman who immediately strikes Laura as familiar, though neither acknowledges previous acquaintance. Have you ever met someone new yet felt you'd known them forever? Felt an immediate, inexplicable connection that defied rational explanation? From the moment of Carmella's arrival, strange occurrences multiply. Laura experiences bizarre dreams in which she feels something like a cat enter her room and a sensation of being caressed, followed by sudden sharp pain. She grows weaker by the day, experiencing lang, strange dreams, and a sense of latitude and fever. Meanwhile, reports circulate of a mysterious illness affecting young women in the surrounding area, with victims reporting nightmares of nocturnal visitations before wasting away. Carmella's behavior grows increasingly strange and intimate. She speaks to Laura in language more suited to a lover than a friend. You are mine, you shall be mine, and you and I are one forever. She sleeps late into the day, never joins in prayer, and appears physically disturbed by funeral processions. Despite these alarming signs, Laura feels drawn to her enigmatic guest, experiencing confusion about her intense feelings that modern readers recognize as sexual awakening. The truth emerges gradually through the investigations of General Spieldorf, whose niece died under similar circumstances. His research leads to the revelation that Carmilla is actually Countess Mircalla Karnstein, a vampire who has existed for centuries by periodically reanimating her corpse and preying on young women. Her name Carmilla is merely an anagram of her original name, a linguistic disguise she employs in each new location. In the novel's climactic sequence, Carmella's tomb is located in the ruins of the Stein Chapel. Following traditional vampire law, her undead body is found immersed in blood, with the sharp teeth of the vampire projecting against the lip. The men perform the ritual destruction, driving a stake through her heart. decapitating her and burning the remains that will supposedly free her soul and protect future victims. Laura, though saved, remains haunted by her encounter with the vampire. The novel ends with her melancholy reflection. To this hour, the image of Carmela returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes the writhing fiend I saw in the ruined church, and often from a reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmela at the drawing room door. What distinguishes Carmela from mere supernatural horror? Le Fanu's sophisticated psychological portrayal of the vampire-victim relationship. Unlike Dracula's predatory violence, Carmela's method is seduction, creating a bond that makes her victims simultaneously desire and fear her presence. This complex dynamic allows Le Fanu to explore themes of forbidden attraction, sexual awakening, and the repressive nature of Victorian society. The homoerotic subtext of Carmela is remarkably overt for its time. Camilla's desire for Laura is explicitly romantic and physical, though cloaked in the language of intense female friendship that Victorians might find acceptable. Laura's conflicted response, attraction mingled with revulsion, mirrors Victorian anxieties about female sexuality in general and same-sex desire in particular. Le Fanu's vampire also departs from later traditions in significant ways. Did you know Carmela can move about during daylight hours, though she is lethargic? That she can pass through solid walls rather than needing invitation? That she can physically transform into a large cat? That she forms emotional attachments to her victims rather than seeing them as mere food sources? These variations remind us that vampire law remained fluid in the 19th century, before Stoker's novel codified many of the rules we now take for granted. Camilla remains a cornerstone of vampire literature, not merely for its chronological priority, but for its psychological depth, its atmospheric setting, and its willingness to explore the erotic potential of the vampire myth. In Laura's ambivalent feelings toward her beautiful predator, Le Fanu captured something essential about the attraction of Gothic horror itself. The way it allows us to explore in safely displaced form desires and fears that society would rather leave buried. Tonight, when you feel that inexplicable chill, that sense of being watched in the darkness, ask yourself, is it fear that quickens your pulse, or something else entirely? The Turn of the Screw. Ghosts of Uncertainty. Is there any ghost story more perfectly, terrifyingly ambiguous than Henry James's The Turn of the Screw? Published in 1898, this novella has spawned more than a century of critical debate, psychological analysis, and competing interpretations. What is its central mystery? Are the ghosts real, or are they projections of a disturbed mind? The tale begins with a framing device. Guests at a Christmas Eve gathering sharing ghost stories by the fire. One guest, Douglas, claims to possess a manuscript written by a woman who was once his sister's governess, containing an experience more chilling than any conventional ghost story. The narrative that follows is presented as this very manuscript. An inexperienced young governess, whose name we never learn, accepts a position at Bullee, a remote country estate caring for two orphan children, Flora, age 8, and Miles, age 10. Their uncle and guardian, a wealthy bachelor residing in London, stipulates an unusual condition. She must handle all problems herself and never trouble him under any circumstances. Despite this red flag, the governess, somewhat infatuated with her handsome employer, eagerly accepts. Have you ever ignored warning signs because you wanted something too badly? Initially, Bullee seems idyllic. The children are beautiful, charming, and apparently perfect in every way. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, is warm and supportive. The governess feels she has found paradise, until one evening while walking the grounds, she sees a man watching her from the top of a tower. Something in his gaze fills her with inexplicable dread. Later, she glimpses the same figure staring in through a window. When she describes him to Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper identifies him as Peter Quint, the master's former valet, a man who we learn had an inappropriate relationship with the previous governess, Miss Jessel, and who exhibited disturbing interest in young Miles. The critical revelation follows. Both Quint and Miss Jessel are dead. The governess becomes convinced that the ghosts of these corrupted servants have returned to claim the children. She begins to see the spectral figure of Miss Jessel as well, seated by the lake or standing in a classroom. More disturbingly, she believes the children are aware of and communicating with these apparitions, though Flora and Miles never acknowledge seeing anything unusual. Can you trust what you see? Can you trust what others claim not to see? James constructs the narrative as a relentless spiral into uncertainty. The governess's interpretations become increasingly fevered. Every innocent remark from the children takes on sinister double meanings. Their perfect behavior seems, in her eyes, evidence of unnatural influence rather than good character. Miles's unexplained expulsion from school, referred to only as something that cannot be discussed, becomes, in her mind, proof of terrible corruption. The climax arrives when the governess directly confronts Flora about Miss Jessel's ghost, which she claims is standing across the lake. The child sees nothing and becomes hysterical, begging Mrs. Gross to take her away from the governess. Flora develops a fever and is removed to London, leaving the governess alone with Miles. In the final devastating scene, the governess pressures Miles to confess his communication with the ghost. As she does so, she sees Peter Quint's face at the window. She clutches Miles protectively, demanding he acknowledge the ghost's presence. The boy finally cries out a question. "Is she here?" which the governess takes to mean Miss Jessel, when she assures him it is not Miss Jessel, but the coward Horror Quint. Miles calls out the valet's name. The governess feels she has won a victory over the ghost, but when she relaxes her grip, she finds Miles has died in her arms. What killed Miles? The ghost malevolence? The governess's hysterical protection? Fear itself? James leaves us suspended in terrifying uncertainty. The brilliance of James's Nala lies in its perfect balance between supernatural and psychological interpretations. If we accept the governess's account at face value, we have a classic ghost story about evil spirits attempting to possess innocent children. But James introduces enough doubt to support an alternative reading that the governess, sexually repressed and romantically fixated on her employer, suffers from hallucinations brought on by hysteria and projects her own fears onto her charges. The text supports both readings. The governess provides detailed descriptions of ghosts she could not have invented, having never seen Quint in life. Yet she is also the sole witness to these apparitions, and her narrative reveals an increasingly unstable mind. The children's behavior could indicate either supernatural corruption or normal childish secretiveness misinterpreted by a paranoid authority figure. Even Miles's death remains ambiguous. Did he die from fright at seeing Quint's ghost? Did the governess, in her delusional state, accidentally smother him? Or did his heart simply give out under the psychological pressure she exerted? Have you ever been absolutely certain of something that others could not see or understand? How far would you go to protect someone from a danger only you perceived? The turn of the screw revolutionized the ghost story by internalizing it, by suggesting that the most terrifying hauntings may be those that occur within our own minds. James's achievement was to create a narrative that forces readers to confront the ultimate unreliability of perception, both the governess's and their own. The novella's legacy extends beyond literature into psychology, where it has been analyzed as a case study in repression, projection, and hysteria. Its influence on subsequent ghost stories is incalculable, establishing the unreliable narrator as a staple of supernatural fiction and demonstrating how ambiguity rather than explicit horror can create the most unsettling effects. In the end, the turn of the screw remains what it has always been, a perfectly calibrated machine for generating uncertainty. A ghost story that haunts us not with apparitions, but with the possibility that we can never trust what we see, or what we are told, or even what we believe we know about ourselves. The Hauler, the invisible predator. I am no longer myself. There is another being inside me which has taken possession of me. Have you ever felt that you were not alone even in an empty room? That something watched you, studied you, waited for you to lower your guard? These chilling words from Guy de Maupassant's The Hauler, 1887, capture the essence of a tale that blurs the boundaries between supernatural horror and psychological breakdown, between external threat and internal disintegration. Written in the form of a diary, The Hauler chronicles the mental deterioration of an unnamed narrator living in a comfortable house overlooking the Seine River in Normandy. Initially content and rational, he begins to experience inexplicable sensations. What disturbs his peace? A presence near him at night? A weight pressing down on his chest? A feeling of being watched by something he cannot see? The disturbances escalate gradually. He awakens to find water missing from his scarf, though he has no memory of drinking it. Flowers picked and placed in his room wilt as if drained of vitality by some unseen force. Pages of his book turn without human intervention. Each incident taken alone might have a rational explanation, but their accumulation creates an atmosphere of mounting dread. Have you ever tried to explain away the inexplicable? To find rational causes for events that defy reason? A crucial turning point occurs when the narrator witnesses a Brazilian ship sailing up the Seine. He feels a strange connection to this vessel, as if it carries something intended specifically for him. Later, he learns from his servant that similar phenomena have occurred before in Brazil, an epidemic of madness attributed to an invisible being that feeds on water and milk. The narrator becomes convinced that such a being, which he names the Hauler, has followed the ship from South America and now preys upon him. He describes it as a more evolved species, a successor to humanity, possessing powers humans lack: invisibility, mental influence, and the ability to pass through solid objects. Most terrifyingly, it feeds not merely on physical sustenance, but on human will and autonomy. In one of the story's most unsettling experiments, the narrator places water and milk beside his bed before sleeping. In the morning, though he has sealed his room and is certain no one could have entered, the liquid levels have dropped. Later, he attempts to see the invisible entity by positioning mirrors around his bedroom. Standing before the glass, he experiences a moment of existential terror when his own reflection vanishes as if absorbed by the invisible Hauler standing between him and the mirror. Can you imagine it? The horror of watching your own image disappear, knowing something stands between you and your reflection, something you cannot see but that can see you. The diary entries grow increasingly frantic as the eerie narrator alternates between accepting the supernatural explanation and questioning his own sanity. He consults doctors, travels to seek relief, even visits Mont Saint-Michel to hear stories of ancient invisible forces that were said to rule the earth before mankind. Nothing alleviates his torment. In desperation, he attempts to trap and destroy the entity. Having lured it into his bedroom, he seals the room and sets his house ablaze, hoping to incinerate his tormentor. But as he watches the flames consume his ancestral home, a terrible doubt seizes him. The Hauler, if he is not dead, when the body is destroyed, does not the soul remain? The story ends with the narrator's grim conclusion that suicide is his only remaining option, as the Hauler cannot be escaped through physical means. Published 3 years before Maupassant's own death from syphilis-induced madness, The Hauler has often been read as a semi-autobiographical account of the author's mental deterioration. Maupassant suffered from hallucinations and paranoia in his final years, and the narrator's experiences mirror symptoms of various psychotic disorders. Yet reducing the horror to mere clinical description misses its brilliance as supernatural fiction. Like the best Gothic literature, it maintains perfect ambiguity between psychological and paranormal interpretations. The Hauler could be a delusion born of the narrator's disintegrating mind, or it could be exactly what he fears: an invisible entity from beyond human experience, a harbinger of humanity's replacement by a superior species. Maupassant wrote during a period of rapid scientific advancement, when Darwin's theories had challenged humanity's central place in creation, and when invisible forces like electricity, magnetism, and radiation were being harnessed by technology. The Hauler reflects these anxieties, suggesting that human dominance of Earth may be temporary, that evolution continues, and that we may be as unaware of our successes as animals are of human consciousness. The story's power lies in its gradual buildup, its meticulous documentation of small disturbances that accumulate into overwhelming terror. Maupassant understood that true horror resides not in dramatic supernatural displays, but in the subtle wrongness of everyday things. Water levels dropping overnight, flowers wilting too quickly, the feeling of breath on your cheek when you are supposedly alone. Have you ever awakened suddenly in the night, certain that something had disturbed your sleep? Something that now waits, watching in the darkness beyond your bed? More fundamentally, the hauler taps into primal fears about the integrity of the self. The narrator's greatest terror is not death, but possession, the gradual erosion of his autonomy, the colonization of his will by another being. "He has taken my place in my house, and I cannot get rid of him," he writes in one of his final entries, expressing a fear more profound than physical destruction, the fear of being replaced, of having one's very identity usurped. In this aspect, he anticipates much of 20th century horror, from invasion narratives like The Body Snatchers to films about demonic possession. It reminds us that Gothic horror at its most effective addresses not merely supernatural threats, but existential ones. Not just the fear of what might harm us, but the deeper fear of what might replace us, erase us, or worse still, transform us into something no longer recognizably ourselves. Sleep well tonight, dear listener. And if you wake to find the water glass by your bed mysteriously emptied, well, I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation. The yellow wallpaper, patterns of madness. Few works of Gothic fiction have achieved the feminist resonance of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892. A story that transforms the conventions of supernatural horror into a devastating critique of 19th century medical attitudes toward women and mental illness. Like The Holler, Gilman's tale takes the form of a first-person journal chronicling the mental deterioration of an unnamed female narrator. What is her supposed affliction? Her physician husband, John, diagnoses her with temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, and her prescribed treatment, a rescue involving complete cessation of work or stimulation of any kind, enforced isolation except for brief visits from John, and confinement to an upstairs nursery in a rented summer mansion. Have you ever been told that your perceptions were wrong? That your feelings were merely symptoms to be managed? That others knew better than you what was happening in your own mind? The room itself becomes a central character in the narrative, particularly its wallpaper described in terms of increasing revulsion and fascination. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard-of contradictions. Forbidden to write or engage in any intellectual activity, the narrator becomes obsessively focused on this wallpaper, projecting her own psychological state onto its chaotic patterns. Initially, she perceives only a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights and not clearly then. Do you see it forming before your eyes? This sub-pattern gradually resolves into the figure of a woman or many women trapped behind the paper's front pattern of bars and strangling forms. The narrator's identification with this imprisoned figure grows as her own confinement continues. "I think that woman gets out in the daytime," she writes, "and I'll tell you why. Privately, I've seen her. I can see her out of every one of my windows. It is the same woman I know, for she is always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight." As her mental state deteriorates, the narrator begins to see these creeping women everywhere, not just in the wallpaper, but outside her windows, creeping around the garden paths. She becomes convinced that she herself was one of these women, previously trapped behind the pattern, but now escaped. In the story's disturbing climax, she locks herself in the room, tears down most of the wallpaper, and begins creeping around the perimeter of the room, smudging the wall with her shoulder. Behavior her husband discovers to his horror when he finally breaks in. "I've got out at last," she tells him, as he faints across her path. "In spite of you and Jane, and I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." What does it mean to escape when freedom itself looks like madness? What happens when liberation takes the form of apparent breakdown? Gilman based the yellow wallpaper on her own experience with the rest cure prescribed by the famous neurologist S. Weir Mitchell for her postpartum depression. This treatment standard for nervous women in the late 19th century prohibited intellectual stimulation of any kind. No reading, writing, or meaningful work, while emphasizing physical rest and feeding. Gilman later wrote that this treatment brought her near the borderline of utter mental ruin, and that she wrote the story specifically to challenge Mitchell's methods. While not overtly supernatural, the yellow wallpaper employs Gothic conventions to powerful effect. The setting, an isolated mansion with something queer about it, recalls the haunted houses of earlier Gothic fiction. The journal format creates the same ambiguity found in The Turn of the Screw in the Holler, leaving readers uncertain whether the narrator is experiencing genuine supernatural phenomena or hallucinating due to her confinement. The wallpaper itself functions like a conventional Gothic haunting, exerting increasing influence over the narrator's mind, seemingly animated by malevolent consciousness. Yet Gilman brilliantly inverts this trope. The wallpaper is not haunted. It is the material embodiment of patriarchal constraints on female identity and expression. The pattern that imprisons the creeping woman symbolizes the rigid gender roles and medical authority that confine the narrator herself. Most subversively, Gilman suggests that what appears as madness may actually be liberation. The narrator's final creeping behavior, though seemingly deranged, represents her rejection of the passive, infantilized role her husband and doctor have imposed on her. She has indeed got out, not from the wallpaper, but from the suffocating constraints of 19th century womanhood. Published in an era when women's political, educational, and professional aspirations were often diagnosed as symptoms of hysteria, the yellow wallpaper stands as one of literature's most powerful explorations of the relationship between gender, power, and definitions of sanity. Its influence extends far beyond Gothic fiction into feminist literary criticism, medical ethics, and the history of psychiatry. Gilman later reported that a copy of the story sent to S. Weir Mitchell so altered his treatment of nervous prostration that he admitted to friends of his he had altered his treatment since reading it. Whether or not this claim is accurate, the yellow wallpaper certainly altered the landscape of American Gothic fiction, demonstrating how its conventions could be repurposed to expose the real horrors faced by women in a society that pathized their desires for autonomy and self-expression. Look around you. What patterns confine your thinking? What bars invisible to others might be all too visible to you? And what would it mean to tear down the paper and finally at last get out? Lovecraft's Revenants, the science of undeath. While firmly rooted in the 20th century rather than the Victorian era, H.P. Lovecraft's tales of reanimation represent a crucial evolution of Gothic themes, bridging earlier supernatural narratives with modern anxieties about scientific overreach. What happens when the ancient fear of the dead returning meets the modern power of science? In stories like Herbert West, Reanimator, 1922, and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, 1927, Lovecraft reimagines the traditional revenant through the lens of materialist science, creating a uniquely modern form of Gothic horror. Herbert West, Reanimator, serialized in 6 episodes for the amateur magazine Homebrew, introduces us to the anonymous medical student obsessed with conquering death through chemical means. Unlike Frankenstein, who worked with electricity and stitched together body parts, West develops a phosphorescent solution that can restore life to recently deceased tissue. His single-minded pursuit of this goal leads him and his reluctant narrator assistant through increasingly disturbing experiments. Have you ever wondered what might happen if death were not the end? If science could breach that final frontier? West's initial subjects are animals, but he soon graduates to human cadavers stolen from morgues and graveyards. His first success, a recently deceased man injected with his glowing serum, awakens not with intelligence but with mindless animalistic rage, requiring West to terminate the experiment permanently. Undeterred, he continues his work through years of medical practice, World War I field surgery, and beyond. Each experiment yielding subjects that return with something crucial missing: their souls, their higher cognition, their essential humanity. The horror escalates as West's earlier subjects, seemingly destroyed, begin to demonstrate a collective intelligence and purpose. In the story's gruesome climax, these reanimated corpses converge on West's lab, dismembering him and carrying away the pieces, presumably to subject him to his own reanimation process, a fate worse than death. Can you imagine a more fitting punishment to become the very thing you created, trapped in a mockery of the life you sought to restore? In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Lovecraft presents a more sophisticated treatment of reanimation themes. Young antiquarian Charles Dexter Ward becomes obsessed with his ancestor Joseph Serwyn, a Salem wizard rumored to have discovered the secret of extending life beyond natural limits. Through research and eventually the discovery of Serwyn's hidden papers, Ward learns and implements his ancestors' methods, not chemical injections, but a combination of alchemy and incantation that can reconstitute the essential salts of the dead into living form. Ward successfully resurrects Serwyn with catastrophic results. The wizard, posing as his descendant, murders Ward and assumes his identity, continuing his ancient experiments in the cellars of the family home. These experiments involve not merely reanimation, but interrogation, bringing historical figures temporarily back to life to extract knowledge from them before returning them to dust. The family physician, Dr. Willett, gradually uncovers the truth. In the novel's most terrifying scene, he descends into Serwyn's hidden laboratory and discovers the partial reanimation of one of his subjects, a being described as a monstrous blasphemy that can only speak terrible truths before disintegrating. "Damn you, Charles Ward. I told you not to call me up without the words. I said there was no use if you only knew the words with the symbols." Willett eventually destroys Serwyn using the wizard's own methods, but not before learning the terrible truth behind his reanimation practices, that they involve communion with those outside extra-dimensional entities with unfathomable purposes for humanity. What distinguishes Lovecraft's revenants from traditional Gothic undead? Their scientific framing. West's reanimation solution glows with radioactive properties. Kerwin's rituals are described in quasi-scientific terminology of essential salts and alkaloid base. These are not supernatural returns but materialist perversions of natural law, reflecting early 20th century anxieties about scientific advancement outpacing ethical constraints. Lovecraft wrote during the aftermath of World War I, when industrial killing and medical advances had transformed attitudes toward death. His reanimated beings embody the era's disillusionment. They return physically but spiritually diminished, suggesting that something essential to humanity cannot be recaptured through materialist means.